On July 16, 1954, bulldozers rolled into a 160-acre orange grove in Anaheim, California, and started tearing it out. 1 year and 1 day. That was all Walt Disney had. No theme park like this existed anywhere in the world. No blueprint, no industry to copy from. The man put in charge of building the whole thing was a retired Navy admiral who had never touched an amusement park in his life. The budget was $17 million. The deadline was fixed, and the rides were still being drawn on paper while the foundations were being poured in the ground. I went through construction records, period accounts, and survivor interviews, and used AI to reconstruct what the work looked like on the ground. This is how Disneyland was actually built. If this is the kind of video you like, please subscribe and hit the like button. The 160 acres Disney had purchased in Anaheim were completely flat. That sounds like a construction advantage. It was not. A theme park built on a flat field is just a fairground. Walt wanted terrain. He wanted hills, riverbanks, a castle sitting above its surroundings, a visual sense of depth and geography. None of it existed. Every single contour of the finished park had to be manufactured from nothing, on deadline, by workers who had never built anything remotely like it. The first task was clearing the orange grove. Bulldozers moved through the property in the summer of 1954, uprooting trees by the hundreds. What they left behind was bare, compacted earth, stretching across all 160 acres, featureless in every direction. The surveyors came in immediately after, staking out the hub-and-spoke layout Walt had sketched with his design team in Burbank. A central plaza, 5 radiating corridors, each leading into a different themed land. On flat farmland in the Anaheim heat, those stakes were the only indication that anything was coming. The earthwork that followed was staggering in scale. Millions of cubic yards of soil had to be moved, cut from some areas, and piled into others to manufacture the terrain the park required. The berm, the 15-foot-high earthen ring that would eventually circle the entire park and carry the railroad on its crest, required grading and compacting along the full perimeter. The river channel for Frontierland had to be excavated from flat ground. The raised ground beneath Sleeping Beauty Castle had to be built up from nothing. The low areas that would become the lagoon and the moat had to be dug and shaped. All of this was happening at the same time across the entire site. There was no sequence of first this, then that. The grading crews, the foundation crews, the framing crews, and the utility crews were all on the ground simultaneously, in different sections, working off plans that were still being revised in Burbank and driven down to Anaheim by hand. McNeil Construction Company held the general contract, but the real coordination fell to Admiral Fowler, who spent his days moving between sections, making decisions on the spot that no drawing had yet resolved. On Friday, July 16, 1954, the first bulldozers drove onto the property. The man Walt had chosen to make it happen was Rear Admiral Joe Fowler, 60 years old, retired from 35 years in the United States Navy. Most recently found supervising tract home construction in the San Francisco Bay Area. Fowler had run the San Francisco Naval shipyard during World War II, overseeing ship production at a scale that dwarfed most civilian building operations. Walt called him directly. Fowler flew down to Burbank, met briefly with Walt, was walked to an office and handed a stack of contractor lists, and 3 weeks passed before he flew home to even discuss a salary. He just started working. His nickname around the site, earned fast and kept permanently, was Can-Do Joe. What Fowler found on the ground was controlled chaos from the first morning. The general contractor was McNeil Construction Company, but the real work ran through dozens of subcontractors, each responsible for different sections and structures, all operating simultaneously, with no real coordination between them except through Fowler himself. On a typical working day, around 800 workers were on site at once. In the final month before opening, that number climbed to 1,200, running in rotating shifts around the clock. What strikes me going through the construction accounts is how unlike any prior building project this actually was. These men were not just grading roads and pouring slabs. They were simultaneously framing a Victorian main street, excavating a river channel, raising a fairy tale castle, and laying the track for a working railroad. while the designers back in Burbank were still drawing the rides that would go inside the buildings being framed. The design team and the construction team ran in parallel. That meant the plans could change mid-pour, and sometimes they did. The site offered nothing natural to work with. It had to be shaped into an entirely artificial geography from scratch. Hills, riverbanks, a lagoon, a castle moat. Everything was made. The berm alone was a massive undertaking, a 15-foot-high earthen ring circling the full park perimeter, dense planted to block all sight lines to the outside world, topped by a working railroad track. In the summer of 1954, it was just a dirt ring being compacted in the Anaheim heat. By opening day, it would be one of the most deliberately designed elements in the history of entertainment. The design operation running alongside construction had no precedent anywhere. Walt's WED Enterprises team, the people who would eventually be called Imagineers, were animators, set designers, model builders, and story artists who had been pulled off feature film production to design a three-dimensional park from scratch. Nobody in the group had built a theme park before. The category barely had a name. They were inventing the rules as they went. How do you make a building that tells a story the moment someone looks at it? How do you design a queue line so guests don't feel like they're waiting even when they are? How do you route traffic through 5 themed areas so that each transition feels like entering a completely different world? None of these had textbook answers. They were solved through model building, site testing, constant arguing, and iteration between Burbank and Anaheim. The single most consequential design decision was forced perspective, applied throughout the park. On Main Street, USA, the Victorian small-town streetscape every guest walks through on arrival. Ground floor storefronts were built at roughly 5/8 scale, with upper floors built progressively smaller still. The effect makes the street feel longer and grander than it is. At Sleeping Beauty Castle, the same principle ran vertically. Lower stonework built at a larger scale. Turret details and spire elements reduced progressively as the structure climbed. The castle stands 77 feet tall and looks considerably taller. This was not accidental. Every number was calculated. The berm served a parallel narrative function. Once guests passed through the train tunnels into the park, the earthen ring and its plantings blocked all sightlines to the outside world. The parking lot, Harbor Boulevard, the orange groves, gone. Walt had studied how movie theaters worked. You walked in, the lights went down, and the outside world stopped existing. He wanted Disneyland to do that across 160 acres. The berm was his curtain. The designers and builders had to negotiate constantly, and it was not always smooth. Attractions were being designed and redesigned while their physical shells were under construction. Tomorrowland, the most technologically ambitious of the 5 themed lands, was still substantially unfinished when the opening date arrived. Sleeping Beauty Castle was the visual and geographic heart of the park. Walt used the term visual weenie for a focal point designed to pull guests forward and orient them through a space. Every sightline in Disneyland was arranged to draw the eye toward the castle. It was what guests could see the moment they came through the entrance tunnel, and it was what they walked toward. The concept came from Herbert Ryman, who produced the first full bird's-eye rendering of Disneyland in a single weekend in September 1953, working directly at Walt's side. The castle drew from multiple sources, most directly Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, which Walt had visited. But the Disneyland version was not a replica of anything real. It was a composite of every fairy tale castle anyone had ever pictured, filtered through the memory of storybooks and distilled into one image that could work at full scale in the Anaheim sunlight. At 77 feet, it was smaller than it looked, which was the whole idea. Forced perspective ran through every element. Larger stonework at the base, progressively finer, and smaller details climbing toward the turrets. Upper brickwork courses are measurably smaller than lower ones. Spire proportions were calculated specifically to extend the apparent height. The moat was shallow and lined, and the landscaping team planted junipers along the bank for a reason that was purely practical. Swans will not eat juniper, and Walt wanted swans in the moat. The castle went up on a steel frame and plaster shell, not stone. Construction photographs from early 1955 show it ringed by scaffolding, with the surrounding Fantasyland still bare dirt beneath it. Workers were hanging decorative elements on the towers weeks before opening. The drawbridge was not lowered for the first time until July 17, 1955, the morning the first guests walked through it. I keep coming back to that detail. The single most recognizable image the Walt Disney Company has ever produced, the castle silhouette on every film, every logo, every product they make, was a structure whose drawbridge had never once been lowered before the day it opened. No rehearsal, no test. It just had to work. The rivers of America, the artificial waterway winding through frontierland, was one of the most technically demanding problems on the entire site. Admiral Fowler's background turned out to be directly useful here, in a way nobody had anticipated. The original plan was to fill the river channel from the local water table. When workers discovered that local groundwater pressure was too unpredictable to hold a stable surface level, Fowler ordered the entire riverbed lined with a thick layer of compacted clay, sealing the channel and allowing the water to be controlled mechanically. It is the same technique used in reservoir and canal construction. Fowler knew it from Naval shore facility work. He ordered it applied without any particular ceremony, the way you would handle a familiar problem. The centerpiece of the finished river was the Mark Twain riverboat, a 105-foot, 3-deck steam-powered paddle steamer. Not a ride vehicle on a track. An actual functioning riverboat. This had been Fowler's original assignment before Walt promoted him to run the whole project. Walt had been looking for a naval expert to supervise the Mark Twain's build, found Fowler, and then realized he needed him everywhere. The boat was completed in late June 1955. On July 13th, Walt brought personal friends to the still unopened park for his 30th wedding anniversary, and the Mark Twain carried its first real passengers that evening on a river that 3 months earlier had been a dirt trench. The same pattern repeated across the whole site. Specialized knowledge being pulled from unexpected sources to solve problems no contractor had ever been paid to solve before. Ruth Shellhorn, one of the few professionally trained landscape architects on the project, kept a detailed diary that survives as one of the clearest first-hand accounts of what 1955 on that site actually looked like. Her entries describe a construction zone operating at the absolute edge of what was physically possible, with attractions being installed, grading still underway, planting happening on top of construction simultaneously with a fixed date bearing down on all of it. Dean Nareth, who worked the final sprint, later recalled putting in 120 hours in a single week. Some mornings the paint on the walls was still wet when the gates opened for test visitors. Disneyland opened on July 17, 1955. Walt had spent the night in his small apartment above the Main Street fire station, a room he had built for himself so he could stop making the round trip to Burbank during the construction push. When he woke on opening morning, the lock had jammed. He was trapped in his own apartment and had to shout through the window until someone came to let him out. It was the first problem of the day. Disney had issued roughly 15,000 invitations. Construction workers, press, studio staff, sponsors, dignitaries. An estimated 28,000 people showed up. Counterfeit tickets had been printed and were being used at the gates. People without any tickets at all climbed the perimeter fences. The park had been built, tested, and stocked for half the crowd that walked through it. Tomorrowland was unfinished. The Rocket to the Moon, Dumbo the Flying Elephant, and Peter Pan's Flight were all closed on opening day. Workers were still painting and hammering in sections of the park as guests moved through them. Walt spotted weeds growing along the canal boat's ride and told his staff to put Latin botanical labels on them and present them as exotic plants on display. Only 3 food facilities were open for nearly 30,000 people. The food ran out within hours. The drinking fountains ran dry in the heat. The temperature exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the freshly laid asphalt on Main Street softened. Women's heels literally sank into the surface as they walked. A gas leak forced the emergency evacuation of Fantasyland for part of the afternoon. The ABC broadcast, Dateline Disneyland, went out live to roughly 90 million viewers, nearly half the country, hosted by Art Linkletter, Bob Cummings, and Ronald Reagan. The 24-camera crew had been briefed to keep lenses away from the problems and toward the smiling faces. 90 million Americans watched what looked like a flawless triumph. The people inside the park called it something else. Disney's own employees gave it the name that stuck: Black Sunday. Walt's response to the press that evening was direct. "We'll settle down and get this place operating. It may take a month before everything's going smoothly." He invited opening day guests back for free. He fixed the problems. By the end of July, the park was averaging over 20,000 visitors a day. In its first full year, Disneyland welcomed 3.6 million guests and turned a profit. What Disneyland built in that 1 year and 1 day cannot be measured in ticket counts or revenue. It was proof, first proof at full operational scale, that a purely experiential environment could be constructed from nothing by people who had never done it before, on a schedule that left no room for error. And plenty went wrong. The asphalt melted. The food ran out. Rides sat dark and unfinished. Walt got locked in his own apartment on opening morning. And none of it mattered. Disneyland opened, imperfect and overwhelmed, and the 90 million people who watched it on television and the 3.6 million who walked through in the first year understood immediately that something entirely new had been built. Not just a park, a different way of organizing experience, a different idea about what a crowd of people could be made to feel inside a man-made space. The contractor system, the parallel design and build model, forced perspective borrowed from film production, the clay-lined river from naval engineering, the berm as a cinematic curtain. All of it became the template. Every theme park built in the 7 decades since has used some version of what Walt's team worked out in a 160-acre orange grove in 1954. It was the city of Anaheim, a farming town that became one of the most visited destinations in the United States within a decade of opening day. It was the ABC deal that gave a struggling network its first top 20 hit and proved entertainment could be sold as infrastructure. It was the corporate sponsorship model that funded attractions no single studio budget could have built and became the blueprint for branded experiences that followed for half a century. And it was the people. The workers who were still hanging decorations on Sleeping Beauty Castle's towers in the final days, before a drawbridge that had never once been lowered was lowered for the first time in front of the world. The original park has been rebuilt and expanded dozens of times. The orange groves are hotels now. Sections of what opened on July 17, 1955 are unrecognizable now. But the bones of that 12-month sprint are still there. The castle, the berm, the railroad, the hub-and-spoke layout Walt sketched in a room in Burbank in 1953. 1 year and 1 day after bulldozers rolled into a field in Anaheim, a man who had been shouting through a window that morning stood at the center of something that had never existed before. And the world changed. If that caught your attention, hit subscribe and give this video a like. And let me know in the comments, what construction project, city, or industrial era do you want me to cover next? See you in the next video.